Today is part of an ongoing series of classes that we're called Herbalism for Activism. In particular, for the course of this class, I'm not debating anarchism with anybody. We will have a separate class on political ideology, just like we're having a separate class on cosmology and cosmogony. And you can come debate anarchism with me there.
Although you may be somewhat surprised to find out that we will, in fact, present a number of different political ideologies and do our best to outline the pros and cons of each in as unbiased a manner as we can. It's almost like we're more interested in informing people than in converting them.
Ian's not an anarchist. I'm an anarchist. You mean that you can be married to someone who doesn't share your political ideology? It's shocking.
Political ideology?
Yes. Believe that you should exist?
Human rights.
No. So, moving along. We're also not medical professionals, psychologists, or psychiatrists. We are clergy. We are members of the clergy. We provide pastoral counseling and certifications in herbalism, which is not the same as allopathic medicine. Nothing in this class should constitute medical advice or an attempt to diagnose or treat any condition, ailment, syndrome, disease, etc. Okay. Today's class
My brain just ran off in an entertaining direction.
Is on the history of herbalism and herbalism as it relates to activism and herbalism as it relates to something called street medicine. I want to say right now that a lot of this is going to touch on the history of medical support as provided by anarchists, which means that a lot of what I'm about to describe was illegal when it was happening, is illegal now.
It turns out that most anarchists are not terribly concerned with everything they do being legal.
I don't believe that legality and morality equate to each other. The Holocaust was legal. Saving the people it targeted was not. Slavery was legal. Underground Railroad was not.
Right. History says what is legal and what is moral and ethical are not the same thing.
Exactly. So, I'm not going to go way back in history. I'm only just going to touch on the fact that herbalism has always provided services to those in need that are not condoned or supported by rigid dogmatic centers of authority. Whether you're talking about herbalists providing abortions when abortions have been made illegal, or whether you're talking about herbalists providing knockout drops to the resistance forces, because that's a thing that they did, or whether you're talking about herbalists. So we have done everything from teach people how to sterilize bandages, to how to cause an abortion, to how to use Datura as knockout lipstick.
Right.
The fact of the matter is, herbalism has always been available to those who are resisting dogmatic, despotic, authoritarian, and fascist dictatorships. Whether that dictatorship is the giant hegemonic Catholic Church, or whether that dictatorship is an unjust king, or whether that dictatorship is Ramses III, for an example from our witches adversary classes.
Well, and I think this is important to note, whether that is not a single person that you can point to, but is instead an interlocking series of systems that are designed to perpetuate
injustice, marginalization, and dehumanization.
And oppression.
Or whether it's... Well, I'll give an example. Herbalists amongst the slaves taught other slaves how to use cotton root in order to induce a miscarriage. Now, this was more commonly used after the United States made it illegal to import slaves, which seemed like it was in support of ending slavery, but really
Was in support of breeding slaves.
Was in support of raping and breeding and stealing the children from existing slaves. So every herbalist who helped someone brew cotton root bark tea to end a pregnancy was resisting an evil authority, an authority that was doing great evil. Herbalism has always been a part of activism, and I believe it can be part of activism as we move forward. But it needs to be done responsibly, and there's definitely been some changes in herbal street medicine from when I learned about it to when you young whippersnappers are learning about it. And I'm going to get into that, but let's keep moving along. So let's talk about the difference between street medicism. Medicism? Medicism? Where did I even get that?
Medicine plus mysticism.
Medicism. Sometimes things make it all the way out of my mouth before I'm like, that's not right English. That's not correct. That's unfortunate. Moving right along. Not all herbalists are street medics, and not all street medics are herbalists. There is a huge overlap between the two. However, many street medics are allopathic. They have allopathic medicinal credentials. They're doctors, they're nurses, they're wilderness EMTs. First responders, they're EMTs, exactly. But not all of them are.
And many of the ones who are have also supplemented their traditional allopathic practice with a working knowledge of herbalism. The fact of the matter is, okay, so one of the reasons that herbalism is so common amongst resistance groups is that it's much harder to control the distribution of a plant you can grow than it is to control the distribution of a pharmaceutical that has to be manufactured, processed, and distributed.
Exactly.
Which means that, for example, an allopathic physician may not be able to write you a prescription for Valium for the injuries that you took when you were doing illegal black bloc action, to pick an example at random.
But an herbalist can brew you white willow bark and poppy seed tea.
Right. Which means that even amongst the allopathic physicians, they often will have dipped into the bag of tricks and tools that herbalism can provide.
Something to understand about allopathic medicine is that a great deal of it derives from naturopathic medicine anyway. It's just better controlled. Well, essentially, the difference between poppy seed tea and an opiate is controlled dosage, precision. Precision is ideal. It really is. I'm aware of the resistance in naturopathic communities to allopathic medicine, but for something like aspirin, white willow bark tea and aspirin contain the same essential ingredients because one derives from the other. However, aspirin is very precise and willow bark is not. Aspirin stays good for longer than a jug full of willow bark tea. That being said, aspirin's not a great example because you don't need a script for it, but for things that you do need a script, insurance, a legal ID.
Between codeine and tincture of poppy.
Poppy seeds are so unpredictable. You don't know how much morphine is in poppy seed tea in advance. Not easily. Which is why we always say, drink this much, wait a half an hour, then drink a little bit more, because there's no way to predict how strong any given seed, pod, or seeds are.
This is why, very brief history lesson, you then got to the point where people were applying heat to applying a slow, gentle heat to, the stuff that you get out of poppy seed pods. And then they took the solid and cut it up in grains, and they dissolved a given number of those grains into an alcohol to make a tincture, and pretty soon you're looking at laudanum, right? Because you're trying to control the dosage. It's not because.
But returning to
Anyway.
herbalism, when you don't have a script, when you may be illegal, when any movement outside of a safe house is dangerous, and if you're coming back to the safe house with a dose for everyone who might have the flu, someone might notice. Then turning to natural remedies makes sense because it's much harder to track someone picking up weeds. Anyway, before we go much further, I want to touch on some of the history of street medicine. We just touched on some of the history of herbalism and activism. I want to talk about street medicine. So I said I was going to tell you the difference between an herbalist and a street medic. So this is the difference. A street medic is a person who is performing medicine for those people who are moving on the street. I know, it's shocking. But I have picked a fight recently. I know, me? Really? Are we sure? So out of character. Because someone insisted that street medicine was only for protests, when, as I was coming up in it, street medicine was for anyone on the street who would not ordinarily be aided by a responder or allopathic physician, including the homeless.
This is okay. First of all, there is a generational gap almost.
Well, that's been targeted a bunch of the communities
between those two opinions, and we're going to be going into the history today of how that definition got shifted, because it wasn't an accident.
Okay, so street medics trace their roots to the organization of medical personnel to support Freedom Summer and the March on Selma in 1965. Don't get me wrong. There were absolutely people doing what was at the time actually referred to as action medicine before 1965. There have been ones since who shifted and played with the definition thereof. But the big organizational movement to train and provide street medicine, with sort of everyone getting trained in almost exactly the same thing, whether they were in New York or Chicago or LA, really came about in 1965 in the Civil Rights Movement. Now, my grandma knew of it when it was called action medicine, and then before that, when it was just part of the resistance, as part of something that was used to oppose the Nazis, as something that was used to oppose fascists in Italy, as something that you saw in China. Basically, there have always been street medics. But street medicine, as we think of it right now, about from that movement in 1965.
This is the point at which the organization thereof became something that would be recognizable based on today, rather than the point at which this practice started.
No, this practice started
prehistorically.
As long as there have been despots and tyrants and people opposing them, there have been those who have taken care of the wounds of those opposing them. So this practice has existed since time immemorial. Specifically, street medicine, as it would be recognized today, comes out of the Civil Rights Movement in 1965. And at the time, it was done under the umbrella of the Medical Committee on Human Rights, and the integration of the American Medical Association and proxy battles to challenge the military-industrial complex in the 1960s. Hopefully that phone call is not important. Decline. Sorry.
You get to deal with it. Shifting around for a second,
I
people.
lost my place in my notes.
Uh,
Okay. So what you start seeing is these organized efforts to support the civil rights movement, to support the Democratic Convention of 1968, to support all these things in the late 60s. You start seeing. So I'm not going to get into how certain organizations banded together in the 70s and then disbanded into the 80s. Um, Basically, there was this idea of the radical political spectrum of the new left.
right. This is post MLK, post civil. Well,
No, this is during. This is the 1960s and 70s.
Okay.
So the radicals of the new left created the basic protocols that define modern street medicine. They came up with the policy guidelines that are used right now. Where I don't always agree with them because I was trained by someone who was older than them, and there were things she disagreed with. But if you're going to go take a class in street medicine from an anarchist enclave today, it is rooted in the new left's design of street medicine. Probably.
Yeah, it is extremely likely to be. The other option is that it's an anarchist enclave that's existed in an unbroken chain for more than 50 years, and there are not a lot of those out there because they tend to dry up and blow away for one reason or another.
It also, so even this one dried up and went away for a while, and came back in 1999 with the World Trade Organization ministerial meetings in Seattle. Basically, there were protests around the World Trade Organization in 1999, where police got really violent with the protesters. And a lot of the older people who trained in the 1960s and 70s came forward and were like, hey, this is how we did shit. And you saw this revival in 1999, which moved into like the 99th percentile protest, which I participated in the 2000s.
This moved forward into, first of all, anti-Iraq protests. Anti-Iraq and Afghanistan protests, because those came obvious just a couple of years later. And man, did some of those get violent.
Yeah, and then the protests against the 1%.
1% or 99%, depending on how you want it about it, protests, and has just sort of continued forward.
So,
it's really weird that was 20 years ago.
It has been heavily influenced by like Doc Ron Rosen, a physician of Chinese medicine who served as the trainer for essentially the street medics who took part in the March on Selma, and the Democratic Convention of 1968 in Chicago, and the siege at Wounded Knee. He founded the Colorado Street Medics and trained many other collectives, including the Seaview Street Medic Collective, and a few others, but some really, really famous ones. Actually rooted in the training provided by someone who specialized in Chinese medicine. So you get a lot of focus on PTSD through breathing, and trauma response through breathing, shock response through similar. Okay, so the second wave of street medicine, which we just touched on a little bit, literally came out of some of the worst police actions of sort of our generation. I'm not going to say that it was anywhere near what people have faced. It's nothing near like the genocide of
right. It's nothing like Birmingham.
But I mean, you're talking use of tear gas, pepper spray, batons, and other weapons. So there's a focus in street medicine on self-care, aftercare, treatment of shock, treatment of CPTSD and trauma, physical and emotional healing after the excitement of a protest. Let's see. In 2001, street medics held their first national conference in Athens, Ohio. This meeting resulted in the Athens Manifesto, a one-page document that collectives generally recognize as important. Um, we say important because it's not the law.
It's
Um,
not even something that individual collectives sign to be bound by. It's sort of like this is a really good mission statement and place to start.
right. It outlines the proposals, rights, responsibilities, and secondary proposals. The first proposal section, medics agree on a number of critical points. They agree to incorporate anti oppression work into their own training. Secondarily, they agree that democratic coordination is just as important as skill in a medical technique. So basically a willingness to work with each other, put your hands where you're told, move where you're needed, voice for the people, serve the people is just as important as medical training. Basically, in the words of the manifesto, oppressive behavior happened in trainings and on the streets and in the clinics coming from Action Medical first aid people. We want to prevent it from happening again. You can be a neurosurgeon or the most experienced trainer around, but if you don't know how to facilitate or are oppressing your behavior, you are doing more harm than good. So basically, everyone is valuable, from the person who is willing to just hold a compression bandage in place to the neurosurgeon. And a neurosurgeon isn't allowed to come in and just be like, well, I'm a neurosurgeon, so everybody has to do as I say.
Right. House MD would not be welcome.
Right. Third, authority has to be yielded to local medics, since they are most familiar with the geographic and political history of the site and situation and with the people of the area. The rest of the document, which is a series of bullet points, covers a wide variety of issues: the right to disagree, the right to check medical references, the value of multiple medical traditions. Basically, it encourages, now it calls them Wiccan, but it encourages that you make use of Chinese medicine, occult techniques, whether those are from a witch or from a pagan or similar, allopathic medicine, and herbalism. The management of clinic areas, which are relatively safe, stable locations, in margins of demonstrations where higher levels of medical care can be delivered. When I've gone over the manifesto with herbalists, and anarchists and street mix, it's always a point of contention. Um, Basically, one reason why people like it is because the manifesto connects us to a national organization.
Or at least a national ideology with a bunch of smaller organized cells that are part of it.
It is a way of essentially saying, sorry, our stream got interrupted. It's a way of essentially saying we all agree to the manifesto so we can all basically get along. It makes the collectives kind of work together, and it makes it a little easier to resolve disputes. It also encourages, like we mentioned earlier, the verifying references. Hard to have a reputation economy when you're stretching across a nation. The internet's made it a little bit easier. That being said, the language of the manifesto does need to be updated. There are people who just don't agree with chunks of it. Anyway.
So it's basically the same problem as there is with creating any sort of foundational document. Everyone agrees that we should probably update this and maybe change things, but getting everyone to agree on what few things to change and what to change them to create a giant versioning conflict because everyone has slightly different ideas of what the Manifesto 2.0 should look like. Reconciling, like, it's much easier to draft a thing and get everyone to agree than to modify a draft of that thing and have everyone agree that those were the correct modifications.
I mean, so some like one of the proposals has been to forbid something like what the Black Cross Health Collective did in 2001 with the blind trials to see what was effective and what wasn't. Because I mean, you get all these people saying, oh, well, this works, this works, this works, but in the moment, you need to know what actually works. So you
Right.
get the Black Cross Health Collective um, deciding to do trials.
Right.
And basically they
doing
sprayed themselves with chemical weapons and they sprayed each other with shit and then they tried everything that.
Right. They basically did completely consensual but not legally documented human medical experimentation
And they
on
came
themselves.
up with, I mean, so if you've ever heard liquid antacid and water as what you use to get rid of tear gas and pepper spray, referred to as law, that's the Black Cross Health Collective. They came up with that. They tested for it. They came up with the acronym, the short mnemonics to help responders know what to do when everything is really flying everywhere. But they were literally testing chemical weapons on each other.
And some people want to say this should not be acceptable behavior, whereas other people say, well, you don't get to tell me what to do if I'm consenting to it in order to further medical knowledge so that when protest gets sprayed with tear gas, they know how to fix it. You don't get to tell me I can't do that.
Right. And then, I mean, you get the Black Cross Collective literally coming up with the idea. Well, I'm sure that they didn't invent the idea, but they are the modern generation, 2000, 2001 to 2004, coming up with activism science. So basically, in the long history of anyone who ever tried to figure out, okay, how high a proof does the alcohol have to be to actually launch a Molotov cocktail? Following in that vein of history,
I don't know what you're talking about. I've never done burn tests on different proofs of alcohol.
they're a little bit my heroes. Just a little bit. Okay. So let's.
My experience, by the way, was at least 120.
The practices of the second wave or current street mix basically combine first wave street medic practice and the politics of 21st century radical activism. That being said, there's good and bad there. The second wave benefits from the legal structure that the first wave fought for. So the first wave came through when state system of licensure prohibited doctors from helping random citizens on the street. None of these are important
You want
phone
me to call
calls.
that number back?
Can you?
799-4433.
I didn't see it.
I did.
Basically, doctors could lose their license. And it was for a time legal to sue someone who assisted someone else on the street. Basically, the Good Samaritan laws, under which street medics operate, have come about from the first wave activists of this first wave of street medicine. I want to note something here. In many cases, during periods of civil unrest, people are not allowed in, including medical professionals. The first clinic that was established after Katrina was a street medic clinic. Or if you go back even further, clinics used to be segregated in the South, just like everything else was. And it was actually illegal in many cases. Is there a strike?
I don't know yet.
For certain people to provide medical assistance to other people. In times of protests, medical professionals often aren't allowed in to the protest. So street medics had to provide assistance no one else was providing, and then they could get sued for providing it, hence the Good Samaritan laws. And it's because of their legal action that we've developed a system where we can legally operate. Now, they were often operating illegally and at risk for lawsuit, but now we do have the nope, it was them letting us know that they have prevented the strike. Now, the condition of the laws do vary state by state. Most of the time, the Good Samaritan laws basically say that people not be grossly negligent or reckless, that they have to at least believe that they are doing good and attempt to do good by some standard that most people would recognize as good. You know,
Right.
putting pressure on a wound.
Right. You were trying to help.
Right.
And the outcome that you were trying to accomplish would be recognized by most people as help. You don't get to practice bad science for what you think is someone's benefit on a random wound victim.
Basically, the average person has to be able to look at this and go, yeah, okay, I could see how you thought you were going to help. This evil missionary woman who went to Africa to make a clinic with no medical training and killed a bunch of kids, that's not what I'm talking about. That is actually an example of someone who operated far outside of any training she could claim she had and did very obvious harm.
Is that
Not just
Teresa you're talking about?
no. This is a recent case where a white missionary woman went to Africa, set up a clinic, and is responsible for the death of many, many, many children. And basically, that is my example of this is not okay.
Look, I can pull it up very easily.
Okay, 105 people died. 105 people died because she was doing things she had no training in. Basically, we're going to move into the ethics now because I think I managed to make it clear the difference between believing you're helping and doing harm.
Right.
By any account, after the first or second death, that woman should have realized she was doing harm and stopped. By 105 deaths, we're beyond the reasonable recognition of negligence and doing harm, which moves us into the basic rules of herbalism for activism and street medicine. So I was taught that there was only one. I was taught that there was only one. And I've learned that there's really two ones that everyone is expected not to break. The hard part for me is I don't agree with the second one. I was taught there was only one. So the first one is you can't hurt the people you're fucking helping. Or as it was taught to people after my generation, do no harm.
See, that's not quite the same thing, though.
I was taught it as you can't be hurting the people you're supposed to be helping. If you don't know what you're doing and you pour something into someone's eyes that cause them to have an allergic reaction, or you use an EpiPen wrong, or, operate in your wheelhouse. Don't go beyond what you've been trained to do. Don't hurt the people you're supposed to be helping. Since then, in the second wave, or really, see, this is another place I kind of disagree. I think that there was more than two waves.
Okay, so you think that as an organizational movement, it started in the 60s, and then,
Could you go close Alexander's door, Tina?
Yes. And then, the Vietnam era radical reorganization would be a second wave, and then modern would be a third, or where are you putting the second one?
So I would say that my grandmother and her friends
Okay,
who
so you're
opposed
backdating.
the fascists and who fought back against the Nazis would be the first wave. The second wave would be the civil rights movement, and the third wave would be what we would be having now. But if I want to be able to have a conversation with anyone in the street medic community, it's broadly agreed that the first wave is the civil rights movement. They based their work on the work of the resistance movement.
If you consider it about the organization rather than the act,
then we're in the
second wave.
But see, the first wave. So see the complication. Okay, before the first wave, before Selma,
Right.
before the civil rights movement here in the United States, there were
resistance medics.
My great grandmother and hers, right? They taught me, right, don't hurt the person that you're trying to help. Don't do shit you don't know how to do. Learn.
And here's how to do a bunch of shit.
Right? That then puts me at odds with the second rule of street medics from the second wave movement, which is that you're Switzerland.
This one.
Yes, do no harm and take no sides. I have been told by street medics now that they will provide assistance to the neo-Nazis, the Nazis, the cops, anyone who's injured. They're Switzerland.
Right. This is the... Okay. On some level, I admire the ideal of preserve all life, preserve all health, help everyone who asks. I can admire the ideology. I do not adhere to it. In fact, I can't adhere to it. It does not work for me. On the other hand, there's a reason I never got a go. There's a reason I didn't go to med school. There's also a reason I didn't go into law.
There's a reason I'm not a physician. Okay. One, I could not handle an infant death. I know this about myself. I would freak out. I would fall apart. I would be useless. Therefore, I cannot operate in the field of medicine. Two, the second somebody came in with a swastika or, the words or 88 on their arm, no, fuck that person. That person can die. Therefore, I make a shitty physician. I was not raised to believe that you helped everyone. I was not raised to believe that you were Switzerland. Now, I was raised that you did not stop applying pressure to a wound to throw the cocktail. If you are the medic, you get to focus on being a medic and let everyone fight around you. You don't get to halt to fight back. Your job is to provide assistance. So there are the people who make soup for the revolution, there are the people who throw the Molotov cocktails, and there are the people with the loudspeaker. And you need to figure out which one you want to be, because where you've said your hands will be is where your hands are expected to be. That's what I was taught. The rule was, don't hurt people you're supposed to be helping. Keep your hands where you've pledged them, right? Not be Switzerland. But that's, if you go to street medic training now, that's what they'll tell you. You're Switzerland. You help the cops, the Nazis, and the people opposing the Nazis, which would mean that you would be expected to help ICE.
Can you go to street medic training classes and not make that promise?
Okay, so it is worth noting at this time that street medic training is not a thing that has any legal standing.
Right. They can't hold you to it in a court of law and be like, well, you trained to uphold these principles and now you're not. The only thing they can hold you to is the Good Samaritan law.
Right, and they also can't require... Okay, so this is where it gets a little weird. Doing street medic training and getting certified by a street medic collective is not a standard that anyone can actually hold you to in any legal or practical way. This back to verifying medical references. It's really hard to, like, by and large, people don't go, oh, where did you get trained? I'm going to cross examine you and interrogate you. They go, okay, you want to help. This is not to say that just because there's not a legal requirement or that people are not gonna necessarily check that you should claim to be a street medic if you don't know what you're doing.
I also like the Black Cross Collective said basically like the people like the neo-Nazis and ICE and the cops have access to allopathic physicians. The EMTs will come in for that. They will come,
like, especially ICE and the cops.
right?
Like, they have their own backup.
Well, the Black Cross Collective also says that they'll back the Nazis. They'll back the KKK.
Yes.
Because they will. They will. Okay? The police were escorting Nazis in Portland not 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
Like, the KKK, the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, the neo-fascists, ICE, the cops, they will always have help. The EMTs and the physicians will always help. But if your hands are busy treating them, then they won't be available when someone needs you. The Black Cross Collective said that if helping the Nazis, then you are doing harm. Hands aren't available for where you pledged them.
Yeah.
Their policy was fight the power, do no harm. That's literally like that's their policy. Fight the power, do no harm. I told you they were a bit my heroes. I like do the least harm.
Right. At the end of the day, do no harm is really hard.
It also tends to be really focused on like preserving your own reputation. Like, oh, well, I took the path that caused the least harm. Okay, but did you get done the shit you needed to get done?
Right.
Right? My grandmother always said, good people get to sit back and pat themselves on the back and say, well, at the end of the day, I'm a good person. But a person who does good things doesn't always get the luxury of sitting back and patting themselves on the back and saying, oh, well, I'm a good person. So which one do you want? Do you want to be a good person or do you want to do good things? I guess she grew up in a different world. Anyway, so let's talk about collective medics and its position on ethics. Because please note, I'm not telling you what to decide.
Right.
It's not happening.
At the end of the day, pick whichever set of ethical guidelines you're comfortable with. It could be one of the ones that we've already mentioned. It could be one that we'll bring up in a minute, or it could be one that you come up with yourself. And on some level, I think that one that you come up with... Okay, the only person you have to live with for the rest of your life is you. Make sure you can live with your ethics.
Let's talk about collective medics versus affinity group medics.
Oh, yeah, okay. This is actually very relevant for understanding modern street medics.
Okay. Collective medics are medics who have organized to support protesters through collectives dedicated to street medicine. They tend to maintain a degree of political autonomy from the groups that the protests originate from.
Right.
So, like, you get a collective of street medics that are dedicated to the ideology of street medicine.
And then
you get the protesters who are protesting.
Who reach out to that collective and say,
will you come support us? You're dedicated to the ideology of street medicine. Collective medics will often go support a protest that they don't agree with.
Right. Because they believe that you are protesting, therefore you should have access to street medicine.
Many people who belong to the collectives are basically, they belong to this ideology that like everyone deserves this care regardless of who they are or what they believe, in the same way that I believe everyone deserves access to knowledge, whether or not I like what they're doing with it, right?
these people are also far more likely to strictly adhere to the ideology of You Are Switzerland.
Right. They are far more likely to adhere to the idea of everyone matters, we don't take a side, we help everyone.
Right.
And I think they're great. I'm never going to belong to a collective.
But the fact, and this is
because the second that they would be like, we're gonna go support the people marching with torches in Charlottesville, I'd be like, fuck you.
Now, the fact that they exist is awesome.
100% support what they do. Like 100%. I think they're amazing, and I actually think that they're probably better human beings than I am. Okay, I think that they are probably better people than I am. I am not that good of a person. I want to stomp on the Nazi. I don't want to help the Nazi. Okay? So I'm an affinity herbalist. An affinity medic has a primary responsibility to the group whose ideology they belong to.
Right. So this is when there is a group organizing a protest and they look around and say, hey, do any of us have street medic training?
So basically, like, okay, I'm going to take it back to Nazis, 1940s, right?
Old school Nazis.
Okay, so there were medics who at the time were considered Switzerland. They wore certain badges, and basically no one fired upon them because they helped everyone. That is a collective medic. Like I said, better person than I am. Because they ran into war zones while bombs were dropping and bullets were flying, and they helped literally every bleeding person on that field. That's some chutzpah, okay? And the idea that they would help everyone, no matter what uniform they were wearing, like, damn, all right, you really firmly believe in what you believe. I don't believe in that. But I'm going to admire the hell out of someone who does. I'm just not that good of a person. An affinity medic, on the other hand, would be someone who was like, I exist to support the French resistance.
And
just the French resistance. If we manage to shoot a Nazi in France, we're all gonna applaud, and I'm not gonna waste my bandages on the Nazi that we shot because we're supposed to be shooting a Nazi.
Right, because then I'd have to shoot him again.
Right.
This...
Collective affinity, right? You get to determine which one you are. I don't get to determine that for you, and I'm gonna admire the hell out of whatever decision you make. Okay?
Right.
Like, even if my opinion does matter to you, my opinion is that those people are probably better people than I am.
Right, at the end of the day, the fact that you want to go into the non-glamorous work of helping people is awesome. Does that make sense?
Yes. Third thing, which I touched on before.
And probably
you are
last thing,
either a medic or a protester.
And I'm going to insert a note here. You can switch back and forth between protests. You can decide...
can't switch back and forth at the protest.
Right. You can decide, this time I'm going to be participating in the protest. This time I'm going to be supporting the protesters as a medic. But you don't get to flip-flop partway through.
Right. The other day, when I had megaphone in hand and the red makeup all down my face and someone collapsed from heat exhaustion, it doesn't matter that I know how to help. I had street medics there who had pledged to help, and they did an amazing job.
Right. Your job was...
My job was to lead the protest. I can't hand the megaphone to someone else.
Yeah.
I mean... I tried a couple times because I had to pee. It didn't work out well.
I can fill it on the megaphone for about 5 minutes. I'm not great at it.
It's one of the reasons why people are encouraged to have a buddy. So in some collective organizations, they just encourage that the street medics work in pairs and that there's two of them. So if somebody does throw, a tear gas grenade at you, that buddy can kick it away. They can get equipment out of your pack. In some, the affinity groups, a medic is always escorted by someone who is willing to fight back.
Right.
So we'll go back to the 40s. I was taught the medic was always escorted by somebody with a gun.
Right. Your job as the medic is not to be a combatant. It's to be a medic.
And that one, I 100% agree with. I'm not saying you shouldn't be armed if you are in a position where you're literally fighting, fascists who are burning your forest down, for a random example.
Right.
Totally at random, not related to anything that's happening right now. I think everyone should be armed, but street medics in particular have a buddy. If you're in the collectives and you are doing the pacifist Switzerland thing, that buddy can be another medic and their job can just be to kick the tear gas away from you and hand you shit out of your pack. Okay? If you're in the affinity group, having someone with you who can hand you shit out of your pack and fire
also,
back,
yeah,
kind of a good idea. Next week, we're going to pick up on herbalism for activism and street medicine as a form of education that opposes the ideology that education belongs to the wealthy, and that teaches shit they don't want you to be able to do yourself, because then you're not supporting the fascist dictatorship
or really the medical industrial complex.
Well, okay, so during the 1940s, right? Nazi Germany. If you don't have to go to the hospital, well, they've lost a method of controlling you.
Yeah.
Okay? If you can go to your buddy who's running a clinic in someone's, hidden room, they've lost a method of controlling you.
What was the name, Ito?
Well, I mean, so the Black Panthers used to take each other's bullets out.
Yeah.
Because if you went to the police, or if you went to the hospital, they reported you.
Yeah.
And then everybody knew, well, you're a member of the Black Panther Party.
Right.
So if you have somebody on your side who removes the bullets, they've lost that tool of tracking and control.
Yeah.
Which means you have to train a lot of people how to take out bullets.
And that's fun training.
So we'll pick up on that next week. Thank you all for...
I have...
Oh, please.
I had 2 points. I can only remember one of them.
I'm sorry.
And it's the pop culture one. Which is that if you decide that you want to be a street medic and you also want to be a badass, you can be Major Kicks. To break out the Clone Wars example.
Mm-hmm.
And you can be capable of taking on a lot of people in a fight and killing your way out of a situation if you have to. But your primary job is still is still the medic's role. It doesn't mean you can't train in the other things.
I think the second point you were going to bring up is the one that we were discussing while I was bathing. About yes, if you have training in CPR. Yes, if you have training...
Oh, right.
I was going to touch on that next time, but you can touch on it this time.
No, that's fine. We can get to that next time.
Alrighty.
That's all I can think of.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope that what you came away from this with is an understanding of the role and the ethics that you will have to determine for yourself. Your guess is as good as mine, okay? And I don't have to live with your choices. You do.
Oh, that was the other thing I wanted to bring up. This sounds crazy and over the top and like an overreaction, right? People doing street medicine at protests don't really have to deal with this kind of violence anymore, right? Unfortunately. Okay, so good news first. In most cases, that's true. The majority of protests that occur today happen without significant injury occurring. Unfortunately, unfortunately,
that's starting
one,
to slant.
That's starting to change. And two, it's still a useful skill set to have when some fucking white boy with a gun who got told the word no decides to shoot up wherever you happen to be that day.
Right? Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well put. Okay. So, thank you for tuning in. I know it's a scary world right now, but there's a lot that we can do to make it less scary tomorrow.
Yes.
Be safe, everyone, and know that you do have the power. Whether you have the power to ball up a t-shirt and press it to an injury in a car crash,
Whether you have the power to have cotton towels in the back of your car.
to take an example at random, you do have the power to help and to make the world a less scary place tomorrow. Because even with 7.5 billion people, every single person who decides to help does tip the scales.